and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, great to have you here this morning. My name is Manus Cranny. I'm from Bloomberg. We're joined by a great panel, which I'm looking forward to. On my far left, it is Lord King, the former governor of the Bank of England. And for good measure, we thought we'd bring in the former Treasury Secretary for the United States, Mr. Jack Lew. Your Excellencies, thank you very much for having us. This morning, there's a feast of news, so we're spoiled for choice on where to start for 2019, but we're never far from a Brexit quote. Lord King, let me take it straight to you first of all. You wrote an op-ed recently for Bloomberg. This is incompetence of the highest order, negotiating a Brexit deal, which is the worst of all worlds. This morning, we've waken up to more hubris and political turmoil in the United Kingdom. Are we in chaos or heading for chaos in the UK and the Brexit debate?
I don't think anyone knows. I think we're not heading towards economic chaos. We're certainly in a period of tremendous political chaos. There doesn't seem to be a majority in the House of Commons route out of it, and almost anything could happen. There is no precedent for this situation. We could see later today or before Christmas a challenge to the Prime Minister. She could get concessions from other European Union leaders. It's more likely that she will get supportive noises from them, but no change to the actual proposed deal. Whether that will be acceptable to the House of Commons, I think, depends very much on their judgment about the political consequences of voting the deal down. So it's all about politics now, not economics, but almost anything could happen.
Before we get to Treasury Secretary, you and I just finished an interview on this, but do you see the risk, Lord King, of Brexit being cancelled?
As I said, almost anything could happen. And the default position is that Brexit will go ahead with the United Kingdom leaving the European Union on the 29th of March. And if the deal is rejected, then the country would leave on and trade on WTO terms. I don't think this is a disaster in the way that some people have portrayed, but certainly one of the reasons for the incompetence that I mentioned in the Bloomberg column was that the United Kingdom did not start preparing in 2016 for such an eventuality. And that was a foolish thing to do because it is now too late to put in place serious preparations to leave without a deal.
The Brexit horses have bolted. Treasury Secretary, you and I have just finished a conversation. My question to you, having lived through a number of tumultuous moments in markets, is this or can Brexit morph itself into a significant financial risk to markets 2019?
Well, Manus, I think Brexit from the very beginning to me has been something that was going to be bad for the economy of the UK. The only question was how bad and would it be managed better or worse. At the same time, I think it is not the case that we're on the precipice of it alone causing a global financial crisis. We're late in the recovery. There's a lot of risks in the world. This is another risk on top of that. I think it's, as Lord King was saying, that accumulated political risk and the anxiety around all of the risks that combined make me more nervous about the future. I don't think Brexit on its own is the issue. I think it's indicative of a pulling away from alliances. It's indicative of a rejection of traditional governance. And I think it is of more concern as a kind of canary in the coal mine with so many questions still open in Europe and around the world.
Okay, those are the global risks. Lord King, a response.
So Brexit is important for the United Kingdom, but I don't think it's important for the rest of the world. It just is not a significant economic issue for the rest of the world. I don't even think it's important for the rest of Europe. They have much bigger worries that they are centrally concerned about. I think Jack's right to point to the fact that what Brexit represents is another example of the political class being unable to cope with concerns that ordinary people have that they have failed to tackle. It's another example of that, which adds to the concern about stability in the world. But in economic terms, Brexit is really important only for the United Kingdom.
A short, sharp answer before we move on to the global stage. Do markets have the capacity to invoke a change in the House of Commons? In other words, pushing the pound and pushing markets, Lord King?
I don't think so, because this is a matter of deep political concern about the constitutional arrangements between the United Kingdom and the rest of the European Union. That transcends short-run economic volatility.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, we're here to talk about the risks for 2019. Brexit is one of them. Lord King has very clearly put it into context. It's not a global risk. Trade wars are. We're waking up this morning to another movement from the Chinese, perhaps proffering some movement on tariffs. Treasury Secretary, can I bring it to you? There's a wonderful line from Credit Suisse. A freeze would be an auspicious outcome in terms of trade wars if we got that at the G20. We're in freeze mode, sir. How big a risk to the global economy are trade wars?
I think you have to look at it both in terms of direct risk and what the spillover risk is. Even between the United States and China, where there are two enormous economies with large trade flows, if you just look at the impact of tariffs on the prospects for economic growth, it's not unlike what I said about Brexit in terms of the UK. It moves things in the wrong direction, but in and of itself, it doesn't cause either economy to collapse. The problem with trade wars is that it is the kind of thing where each party is trying to figure out what is the other going to do. And the risk of miscalculation is enormous. I think right now, if there is a moment of a freeze is about as good as I think we're going to see on a sustainable basis. I don't see either side making the kinds of dramatic changes that kind of resolve this once and for all. From my perspective, the issues with China are not trade balances exclusively. It's these issues related to intellectual property, it's the issues related to access to markets, things that are really structural issues which, from the US perspective, administrations of both parties pushed on for a long time. It's kind of ironic that the focus has become trade balances at a time when US policy is driving trade balances in the wrong direction, running enormous fiscal deficits is increasing trade deficits. So I think there's a confusion on the US policy, and hopefully what will come out of this is a kind of constructive engagement to deal with the core issues with an understanding that there's going to be some progress, but it won't be something which the problem is solved once and for all. The question of inevitability of conflict, to me, is the thing that's making for so much nervousness right now. There's been some thought for a while that conflict is becoming increasingly inevitable. Now the actions are making the conflict become more real. I think backing away from that is a good thing.
Okay, so we're in a 98-day hiatus. He's an Englishman living in New York. I'm channeling a song by the Police written many years ago. Lord King, how do you look at trade wars as an Englishman in America?
So I share Jack's view that in and of itself, tariffs will not make an enormous difference to the scale of trade and the performance of the world economy. But these battles on tariffs are coming at the worst possible time, because ever since the financial crisis 10 years ago, we've been through a period of relatively slow growth. The US has grown faster than most economies, but the rest of the world has not done particularly well. And we're now entering a period where there are quite serious signs of a slowdown right across the world, not just in any one part of it, but right across the world. You see it in the United States, you certainly see it in all the major economies in Europe, you see it in China, and you see it illustrated in oil prices falling back. The last quarter has been bad news for the world economy, and my worry would be that the sense that there is a cooperative group of countries trying to find their way through these problems will disappear if it's translated into a tariff war. And I think the unfortunate thing here is there was an opportunity for a deal, if you like, a grand bargain between the countries with the biggest deficits, the United States and the United Kingdom, and the countries with the biggest surpluses. The European, well, the euro area, the monetary union in Europe on the one hand and China on the other. And I think President Trump is going for the wrong target, because far and away the biggest trade surplus in the world today is out of the euro area. The cumulative surplus of the euro area in the last 5 years is around $2 trillion, exactly mirroring the United States deficit. And I think that is a worry and a concern, because I don't think borrowing and lending on that scale could continue without some consequences.
Can I take from that, just one second, can I take from that then you expect an escalation in trade disquiet, trade wars, trade discomfort in 2019 from the numbers you've just quoted in regards to Europe?
I don't think it necessarily happens in 2019. After all, we've seen, in my view, the problems building up in the world economy have been growing steadily for almost 20 years, as we've seen interest rates come down and down and down. And central banks are desperate, I think, to get interest rates back into more normal territory. But in the absence of, policies, as Jack said, if the United States, the United Kingdom run bigger budget deficits and their national saving rate goes down, that's going to exacerbate the trade deficits and surpluses.
The fact that Mervyn just referred to about the trade surplus in Europe, a lot of it comes from Germany. And when I was at Treasury just 2 years ago, when we looked around the world, the numbers of trade surplus in Germany versus other countries was already very significant. Now, they don't have a currency, so it wasn't a question of was it currency manipulation. I thought it was a question of Germany running a fiscal policy that was too tight at a time when it could have contributed to more global demand by having more German demand. But there was a reluctance to do that for domestic reasons. The G20 didn't turn out to be a particularly effective forum to drive Germany into loosening up at that time. But I think it is ironic that the ceasefire between the United States and China will lead to the export of more German cars from the United States to China, because it's largely German cars that are going to benefit from the rollback that was announced in the last few hours.
And it'll be interesting to see where some of those European stocks, the auto stocks, the Daimler, the VW, etc., open today. It sort of comes back to your world, doesn't it? Many people are speculating about central bank, Lord King, in regards to what the PBOC might have to do, in regards to the authorities might need to yield in China, and the Fed, and whether they are at the top of their hiking cycle. So here we are back in your world, Lord King, in terms of we're very used to central banks saving us, aren't we?
So I think it's interesting that in the last 3 months, the tone of the comments of the Federal Reserve have changed. Now, that's a sensible adjustment to what's going on in the world economy. But I think what it indicates is that the idea that central banks should engage in forward guidance is a very dangerous path to go down, because we can't forecast the future with any degree of precision. And when the world changes, then you change the interest rate path that you set. So to somehow try to give markets the impression that interest rates will go up 3 or 4 times over the next year is precision beyond our ability to make that forecast. And I think we're seeing the Fed and other central banks back off forward guidance now and basically follow the data. So what we've seen in the last 3 months is, I think significant signs of a weaker world economy in 2019 than we had expected 3 months ago. Who knows what will happen in the next 3 months?
Are we down to that shorter time frame, Lord King?
It's a short time frame for quite a significant change, but we've seen slowing in the Chinese economy through 2018. We've seen much weaker figures for growth in the major European economies. And as I said, oil prices have reflected this.
If you look at the kind of macroeconomic trends, they are softer on their own, which may be partially explained by being very late in a cycle of growth. But we're also seeing policies that are moving in the wrong direction. So you asked whether trade was going to become the kind of straw that breaks the camel's back. It certainly slows growth to have these kinds of policies. So when you ask what policy can do, whether it's monetary policy, fiscal policy, structural policy, it ought to move things in the right direction, not the wrong direction. And at a time when the Fed is going to have to make very difficult decisions based on data that is not entirely clear and that keeps changing, to have policy confusing that environment makes it a harder job.
Well, one thing which is fairly certain, I think, is debt. The end of alchemy is something that I know that's Lord King has written about, but debt in the United States of America is going to exceed $1 trillion by 2020. That is not my estimation. That's greater minds than I from the CBO. Gentlemen, how worried should this audience be about debt. The $1 trillion in your country, Lord King, we've got our own little bit of a debt pile going on, don't we, as well at home?
So I think we should be concerned about the amount of debt in the world economy. It was growing before the crisis, and indeed I think you could say that the underlying cause of the financial crisis 10 years ago was in some Western countries too much borrowing and too much spending. What do we say was the answer to it? Even more borrowing, even more spending. And of course, in the very short run, that is a sensible response.
Yes.
But there comes a point when that short-term response has to translate into a longer-term reversal in which countries like Jack's and mine need to save more and invest more, and countries like Germany and China need to spend more and save less. And I think President Trump missed a real opportunity. Instead of using, say, the G20 to recognize that there was a deal to be had, in every country recognizing that just looking towards its own decisions might not be enough to guide the world economy back to a healthier state, but instead to engage in this, we'll impose tariffs unless you do this. This was a counterproductive way of achieving what I think is needed, which is a deal to manage the world economy better. And I think Jack is right in saying that 10 years ago, the G7 handed to the G20 a real opportunity to manage the world economy. The G7 consciously took a step back and said to the G20, you take over. And the G20 did very little with it. And now the G7 have had to take it back.
Okay, the trajectory that you're on, Treasury Secretary, and we spoke about it on the television just a moment ago, $1 trillion, a growth rate which, by all accounts, greater minds than I say will fade a little bit next year. Still quite strong, looking relative to the past 10 years. Are we building a crisis? Are we building the risks of recession coming blindly towards us, perhaps that we don't see coming towards us, Jack?
I think a couple of things. First of all, building the deficit at a time of strong economic growth is backwards. You ought to reserve the ability to use deficit spending to get an economy moving when it's in trouble. So for the United States to be building this enormous pile of debt during good times takes away the ability to respond when we get to that inevitable moment when the economy will need some help, because there is a limit to how much you can borrow. I don't think the United States is on the verge of losing access to credit in any meaningful way. As you and I were talking,
yes,
the U.S. Treasury markets are still the deepest and most liquid in the world. The price of borrowing will go up because that's what happens when you borrow more, and it will start to put a squeeze on other credit-related activity. But I think almost more importantly and more immediately, it's going to make it more difficult for the United States to invest in the kinds of things that it needs to have a good, strong, healthy economic future. Investing in infrastructure, investing in research and development, investing in educating the next generation. If you're already running a $1 trillion deficit to finance a tax cut that the economy didn't really need, you don't have the ability to use those same resources to do other things that the economy does need. And I think it's very short-sighted. I don't think it means we're going to enter a recession because of it, but we'll be less in a position to respond to the next recession.
Do you worry about recession risk at the moment, or is it just media people on the TV like me that talk about it and trump out statistics?
Well, it's certainly media people that like to use words like this.
Okay, Lord King.
Central bank governors don't. But I mean, every now and then there are downturns and recessions. People almost always fail to predict them. And indeed, we shouldn't put too much weight on forecasts. That's one of the terrible mistakes of policy. We should react to things as they happen. But the signs now are that we are seeing a slowing into next year. And Jack is absolutely right that we don't want to be in a position where monetary policy can't respond very far because interest rates are low. It doesn't make sense to raise rates merely to try to cut them later. Interest rates are low because the world economy hasn't been expanding quickly enough. And if fiscal policy is also in a position where there isn't much room for maneuver to allow a fiscal expansion with a downturn, then I think we will find it very difficult. And we saw in the case of China that what China did after the financial crisis, when it saw its exports fall very sharply, was to say, well, we'll engage in a big demand expansion at home by building infrastructure. And what that did was to create infrastructure projects which were incapable of repaying the loans which were taken out to finance them, and the Chinese financial system is paying the price for that. So there is no simple and easy way out, and I do worry that there is plenty of scope around the world for some defaults, whether it's banks in Europe, whether it's some sovereign default. We're seeing emerging market sovereign debt problems growing, whether it's a part of the Chinese financial sector. Think back to 2007-8, when some quite small changes in the subprime mortgage market and those 3 funds in the French bank that stopped redemptions, it could be the case that quite, a small number of apparently unrelated defaults change sentiment towards the amount of debt. And that's how you can create concern about the ability of financial intermediaries to meet their obligations.
Where is the risk hiding, as Lord King alludes to, maybe in risk in your view in the bond market, maybe?
I think that 10 years after the financial crisis, there's a risk of complacency that we're not looking for where are the early signs of stress that might require response. I worked with Mervyn at the end of his tenure at the Bank of England, the beginning of mine at the Treasury Department, and it was a moment when we were all painfully aware that missing the moment meant that you would not have the opportunity to respond most effectively. So you look at debt in the United States, how much just barely investment grade debt there is in the United States, how little it would take for a lot of that debt to become non-investment grade. A lot of it issued by non-traditional financial institutions. Where that is going through the financial system is not well mapped. Does that sound familiar? Now, I'm not saying that that is going to become the subprime crisis of the next generation. But I know that if I were in a position of responsibility now, I would be asking those kinds of questions. And because of the complacency, I don't know if those questions are being asked. And I don't know if the radar is where it should be to see a problem developing. I think if you look back before 2007, there are a lot of reasons to say it would have been nice to have seen it coming just a year or two sooner.
Are we better equipped to see the next global crisis coming towards us, Lord King?
We're certainly better equipped in the sense that our banking system is better capitalized, and more importantly, I think we, having had the experience of dealing with the last crisis, we would know better how to cope with a banking crisis again. But that's not the only source of problems. And in many ways, I think people are a bit complacent in simply saying, well, the banking system is safer. The banking system is really the source of the problem. It's the symptom of the problem. And I would worry that there are enough debt out there that if there were some defaults, you'd start to see people marking down the value of assets in financial institutions. And one of the things that the stress tests that are carried out in each country often ignore is that they look at a stress in their economy, assuming the rest of the world is the same. And I would worry that what will happen is that if things start to go wrong, it will go wrong rapidly around the world, and then the stress test will look inadequate. And one of the things that worries me is that if you look at the US economy, it's got a stronger banking sector than anywhere else. It's got a rule of law. And yet, the US government is paying a higher interest rate to borrow for 10 years than almost any other advanced industrial economy. To me, that does not tell me there's something wrong with the United States. It tells me there's something wrong with the rest of the world in that they've got, and the markets expect interest rates to remain unnaturally low. Why? Because they don't think that the rest of the world is capable of getting back to the sort of long-term growth rates we experienced before the financial crisis.
And to go back to where we started in terms of the geopolitical uncertainty, if there were a global economic crisis of some sort, one has to ask whether finance ministers, central bank governors, leaders could get together and make the kinds of judgments that were made in 08, 9, and 10. This is not a moment where governments are as open to reaching out and taking actions to help others because
is that the biggest risk, that we have this disintegration of geopolitics around the world?
I think the two come together. I mean, it's only a matter of time. The economic cycle has not been repealed. There will be a downturn, whether you name it one thing or another, there will be an economic downturn. It will take leaders of various levels coming together to take decisive action, and I think it's this political chaos that makes it more of a risk that action will be hard to take.
Okay, I've just got back from Vienna. I spent 2 days chasing a variety of ministers, one of them who is in the room, His Excellency Al-Mazrui, who, along with the rest of the members of OPEC, agreed to cut production. OPEC by 800,000 barrels, non-OPEC by 400,000 barrels. We are in Dubai, we are in the UAE, oil matters. I see the market as this: Trump at $50, I see Saudi Arabia at $73, and I see Russia in the middle at $60. What defines stability in the oil market, Lord King?
What defines stability is not a particular price, but a set of arrangements in which people believe the market can function in the way that most markets should function, long-term supply being there available to meet demand. There are big changes in the structure of the oil market, not just the US and fracking, but elsewhere. There are alternative sources of energy. I think what we've seen in the last few months is a purely short-term reaction. I have no idea what will happen in the future. People here are better able to answer that question than me. But what I do think is that the events we've seen in the last 3 months, to me, indicate that the market at least is worried, I'll put it no more highly than that, but it's worried that we may be moving towards at least a significant slowdown, if not a downturn in the world economy.
I think managing supply is about allocating the rents in the economy as it exists. The real question is what global demand is and what demand for fuel is. And having a strong global economy will lead to more stability. I was struck in 2015, 2016, when the decision was made to reduce production in the Gulf. I didn't understand how that was a long-term good policy, and I was told it was to maintain market share. But it ended up causing this kind of instability where there was a concern it was terrible for the US economy, and I wasn't so sure that a higher price of oil was as bad for the US economy because we produce so much oil now ourselves, and that we would get through it. I think some of the structure of the oil markets is changing, but the thing that doesn't change is that it's aggregate demand that is going to drive long-term stability.
Well, neither of you are very bullish about, sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but the conversation that we've just had in 25 minutes, neither of you are sending me out of here with a very bullish view on demand or maybe the world. I know maybe that's in the short term and a lot can change, but...
Yes. It's only the short term. So let me give the optimistic view about
go on.
the long term. In the last 10 years, growth has been below the average growth rate that we experienced in the 50 years running up to the financial crisis. There are some economists who believe that the growth rate in the next 50 years will be lower than before. We've run out of ideas in the world, etc. I don't believe that for a minute. I believe that innovation is at least as strong as it's been for a very long time, and that if we can solve the problems of the inability of countries to find sustainable sources of demand, by which I mean the US and the UK have to find a way of relying less on consumer spending, export more and invest more, and China and Germany need to restructure their economies to export less and rely more on domestic spending. If we can find a way to that, then I think the world economy outlook is very buoyant for a period of 20 or 30 years, because I think the long-term growth rate can be at least as high as it was before in terms of productivity, and I think there is a gap to be made up because of the weak growth over the last decade. So I think the long-run prospect is of strong growth with low and steady inflation. But we have to find a way of getting from where we are today to a better balance in the world economy.
And that's about rebalancing economies, isn't it? Something that we're very familiar here in the GCC.
First, let me just clarify. I think I reversed the signs. When I said decrease output in 15, 16, it was increase, and I apologize for that. Look, if I want to be optimistic about the economic future, you look at China, you look at India, you look at the emerging economies of the world. The potential for expanded consumer-led economies driving up global demand is enormous. It's one of the reasons why I've always thought, like with the US and China, the things the US recommends for China to do, or China needs to be affluent have an affluent middle class in the future. I think the long-term trend is going to move in that direction, but it's going to shift where income and consumption in the world is, which is why I thought it was such a mistake for the United States to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because one of the premises of that was you want to be part of the growing parts of the economy of the world. Beggar thy neighbor policies are not good.
I know, and then we write Bloomberg headlines like the slowest growth in more than 2 decades in China, and I get very excited at 8 a.m. Time is the thief. We've got 3 minutes and 20 seconds left, if somebody can just confirm that. I'd like to open to the floor for a few questions. I was supposed to go for longer with questions. Can we please get a microphone to the back of the room there, please? Please say who you are and stand up.
Yeah, Rasha Al-Jundi from Orient Research Center in Dubai. I just want to ask about the role of China's economy in the world. Researchers are talking about a bigger role of China in the world stage. So if the West and the US brought free market and bilateral trade agreement, what rules and what principles will China bring to the world, and what impact should we expect in the region, and how should
just
we...
one question, because time's against us.
Sorry.
Exactly what do you want to know? What kind of trade rules would China accept, yeah?
Yeah.
And to which individual? To Lord King first, to Treasury Secretary Jack Lew.
So look, I think that the growth of China and China's emergence as one of the 2 largest economies of the world means that China has to be part of helping to make the rules for the future, but it also has to accept living within the rules that the world subscribes to. I think that China was moving in a direction that was more positive before we were in this enormous conflict with each other. That doesn't mean that they will become the United States or the United Kingdom. And the question is, how do you have norms where China and other emerging economies feel as much invested in the norms? And we tried both to put pressure on China to do things in a way that was fair, but also to have China feel more invested in the rules of the world going forward. I worry that in a world of greater conflict, China might be more inclined to export its own rules, which are not, I think, positive in terms of either the US or the Western economy.
Well, that's about fractionalization of G20, of WTO. Lord King, any quick response on that?
Let's take one more question.
We need one more question. Somebody raised their hand. The microphone over. Raise your hand. Don't be shy. Here we go. This lady here. Sorry, we'll do this man very quickly, and then this lady. We've had one lady. Let's do one man. We need diversity.
My name is Omar Lama. I'm the Minister of State for Artificial Intelligence in the UAE.
Your Excellency.
I have a quick question with regards to the economic slowdown globally because of G7 slowing growth, or for example, specific countries like China and the US. What would a small or medium-sized country need to do for it to be able to survive the next, let's say, crisis, if one comes, or the next depression or recession? What policies need to be put in place? What things should we look out for?
Well, I think one thing is to be less dependent on borrowing in overseas capital markets. I think it means broadly balanced trade, but it means also worrying about particularly financial institutions and making sure that they don't get into a debt crisis. There's no doubt that what we learnt in 2008 was that if the banking system comes under pressure, people lose confidence in it, and there's a run on the banking system, people stop providing finance to it, that can have devastating effects on the economy as a whole. So I think putting in place a series of measures to ensure that the banking system is stable is absolutely crucial.
Final word to you, Treasury Secretary.
I would say that the economies that have had independent central banks, that have had fiscal policies that were stable looking ahead, are doing better than those that were trying to take advantage of the moment without regard to the future. And there's something to be learned from that going forward. Borrowing more than you could afford in dollars wasn't a great strategy for long-term stability. I think we're at a moment where some of the pressures are to take away the independence of central banks. And I think we have to be concerned about that. And if I were in a small, medium-sized economy, I'd want to look over the moment to, do I have stability beyond the moment?
Gentlemen, thank you very much. That's Lord Mervyn King, former Governor of the Bank of England and author of The End of Alchemy, and former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew joining you today for the World Economy 2019. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting us.